We are ready for chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians as we keep working our way through the book. And we are ready for our second section. This is the outline we're following. Paul explains his ministry, chapters 1 through 7, finished that last week. The middle section, chapters 8 and 9, is Paul encourages a collection. And then Paul answers his critics, 10 to 13. We're in that middle section. Starting chapter 8, finish that next week, not next week, but 2 weeks from today. Next week, E.R. Hall will be here preaching for us. But anyway, we'll look at those two chapters in this middle section. Let's review where we've been, our chapter titles. What was chapter 1 about? All right, very good. Suffering and comfort and change in his plans. They thought he was fickle because he changed his plans. Chapter 2. All right, yes, the reaction to the news from Corinth. How the letter had been received. He was anxious to hear about that. Who told him how it went? Titus told him that as he met with him. All right, chapter 3, what was it about? Yeah, he's a minister of the new covenant and not of the old. We see a great contrast between those two chapters. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 go together as a unit, focusing on the ministry. What is chapter 4 about? Yeah, consequences of an unveiled ministry. He had mentioned it being unveiled in chapter 3. Chapter 5, reasons for the service, reasons for the ministry. Here's the reason for serving God, as Paul did. This is what makes him tick. Chapter 6, demands of the ministry. So here's the consequences, and here's the reasons, and here's the demands. Those seem to go together as a unit. Last week, chapter 7, may have a different title than I have, since Micah taught it. Yeah, it was an appeal to be received. I think chapters 2 and 7 point back to that fornicator being penitent in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, but anyway, an appeal to be received. All right, let's go with a summary. Question number 1 for today. How would you summarize chapter 8? I'm sorry? Collection for the poor saints. Very good. Yes, chapter 8 and chapter 9 have to do with giving, but particularly giving for a specific purpose, and that is a collection for the poor saints. Where have we seen this previously? I heard somebody. All right, Romans and 1 Corinthians. Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16. We'll come back to those passages in a moment. But his instructions to Corinth was in 1 Corinthians 16. The same event was talked about in Romans chapter 15. Chapter 8 deals with the need to do what they had planned. The church at Corinth had made plans to put this contribution together, and they haven't done that yet. And so they've made plans. They were ready a year ago, and now he says to them, now perform the doing of it, is the King James rendering of that. All right, here's an outline of chapter 8, as I have outlined it. If time permits, I'll show you an alternative that Micah's put together that I like. But here's the collection for the poor saints at Jerusalem. He deals with the example of the Macedonians. What churches do we know in Macedonia? Talks about the churches of Macedonia. Do we know any churches in Macedonia? Philippi? Thessalonica, Ephesus is in Asia. Berea, yes. All right, so here are those 3 churches that we know of. Were there others? Perhaps, but those are not recorded. At least there's not any reference of that in the New Testament. Perhaps there were more. There may have been twice as many or 3 times as many, but we know of those churches. So here are churches in Macedonia, serve as an example. We'll get the details of that in a moment. Then secondly, the Corinthians are urged to do the same thing now. In other words, do what they've done and put your contribution together and perform the doing of that. And then he says in verses 13 to 15, this is the more difficult section of the chapter, that there may be equality. There's several interpretations given of that. We'll share some of those when we get to that point. And then he talks about the messengers carrying the collection and the responsibility they have and how his confidence in them. All right, any questions on where we're going? What we're going to accomplish here? Question number 2. Why was it the churches of Macedonia gave so freely? They gave themselves first. Verse 5. They were totally and completely dedicated. They gave themselves, and then giving anything else came quite easy, I think is the answer to that. And we'll come back to our questions as time permits. All right. You might make a marginal note if you're so disposed in your 2 Corinthians 8. These are parallel passages. By parallel passages, they're not just talking about something similar, because like Acts 11 or any other passage that deals with benevolence may be parallel in the sense they're similar. But these passages are talking about the same identical circumstance, the collection for the poor saints at Jerusalem. So when I read one of these passages, let's just take like 2 Corinthians 8, my understanding might be enhanced by knowing something about Romans 15 or 1 Corinthians 16 or the next chapter, chapter 9. So if I want a complete picture of this collection for the poor saints, then Romans 15 is going to give me some information. So Romans 15, 25 to 30, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, and then these two chapters, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah, it was. It had started as 1 Corinthians is being written in about 55, 56. Now, if you're talking about the same year, was it all in 55 or all in 56? Did it go on to 57? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But yeah, we're still dealing with the 19 COVID here in 21 and probably will in 22, 23. Yeah, same time period. All of these chapters are talking about that same event, to my knowledge. Now, there may have been other circumstances earlier, like in Acts 2 and Acts 4, that would have been earlier than this. There was a need for the saints to be taken care of.
I mean, it must have been bad enough because it's not like there's not problems all over this Asian.
Right.
For them to want to send money to, there must have been starvation. There must have been something in the back.
Yes, because even those that were giving were in poverty, as we're going to see, the Macedonians. So anyway, that's a good question though. And as far as I know, these are dealing with the same time period, Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8, 2 Corinthians 9. All right, let's work through the first section here, the example of the Macedonians. Let's start with a practical lesson from that. There is a practical thing to learn here, and that is examples of other churches doing what they should do. Finish my sentence. I'm sorry? Okay, regardless of what others are doing. That's good. Let's do that again. Let's get even another lesson. Yes. Yes. And so while we are independent, autonomous, not governed by what another church does, that's true. What another church does can serve as an encouragement for us to beef it up and do a little better. Would you agree with that? And it could serve as a great example. And that's what Paul's doing here. Some think if you mention a church, here's a church that is smaller in number and they don't have great paying jobs, and yet in that congregation, and yet they've put a contribution together to support preaching of the gospel. And so we can even do better than that. Well, no, you shouldn't compare churches and you shouldn't use one church to encourage another. That's what Paul did here, wasn't it? He cited the example of the Macedonians. Now, as far as we know, there was a church at Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. Let's see what happened with these churches. Verses 1 to 3, they gave liberally and beyond their power. Verse 1, he said, "Brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia." Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. It talks about the grace of God. Typically, we think of the term grace in the sense of something we receive, and that's true. And those who received the contribution, those who received the the money to help them, could view that certainly as a matter of grace. Would you agree with that? But this is viewed from the standpoint of the Macedonians giving, and that was considered the grace of God. That's unique. You don't see that phrase even used that way very often in the New Testament. Does that make sense? Then I want to talk to you about the grace of God that came upon the Macedonians. Well, okay, Paul, what are you saying? They gave liberally. Does that make sense? That giving is a part of receiving the grace of God. And we haven't got but through verse 1 yet. Now, verse 2, I'm hesitating a moment because I'm looking for my parallel translations. I wanted to share with you at verse 2, that in the great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. That's a lot of words. So let's work through that. I think what he's saying here, now what about the affliction? What is that affliction? There's some question among commentators. It may be affliction in the sense of persecution. Well, we know Thessalonica was under a cloud of persecution when Paul left. So severe, he wondered if the church is going to make it. So it may refer to that. Others think that the affliction probably is their poverty, and that's the same thing. And I'm not going to argue that because I don't know how I'm going to argue one side or the other. I'm just saying those are two different possibilities. Either way, under severe persecution, they still gave. Or under extreme poverty, I know that poverty was there, and that is their affliction. Their poverty was such that they were considered afflicted. That in the great trial of affliction and the abundance of joy, that they were glad to give, is the point. Their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. They gave very liberally out of that affliction. I'll share with you a couple of translations. The New American Standard 95, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. The New Living Translation, they are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they are filled with abundant joy, which overflowed in rich generosity. I like that. Now, that's more of a paraphrase than it is, but that gets to the heart and the point of the text. Make sense? You might have another translation that you think enlightens us a little bit. The New Century, they are tested by great troubles, and they are very poor, but they gave much out of great joy, which does get to the heart of what the point of the chapter, verse 2 is. Now let's go and get verse 3, and we'll summarize. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, beyond their ability, they were freely willing. What does verse 3 tell you? Absolutely. Have you ever known of someone who gave to a cause? It may have been something concerning you, or maybe you're the one collecting the money, and someone gave, and they gave beyond what you thought their ability was to give. And I have been in the middle of that at times, where maybe putting some money together for someone in need, and someone comes and they give, and you're thinking, I'm not sure you've got that much to give. And they give sacrificially, but they give willingly, and they want to give even beyond their ability. So here's the point. They gave very liberally beyond their power, even in their poverty. Now, what practical thing do you learn from that?
When I'm reading about them, it's like they're more concerned about their spirituality than they are food because they trust in God.
All right. That's a good point. They're more focused on spirituality than they are material things. What do we often do, self-included, at times when there may be a need? I would like to give, you finished my sentence, I'd like to give, but I don't have it to give with. Mark? Not a good time right now. You think it was a good time for the Macedonians? They gave out of their poverty. Now let's begin at verse 4 now. Verse 4, they requested to have fellowship in the matter. Now, there's two things we're going to learn here. Imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift. What does that tell you about their attitude? They really wanted to help. It wasn't a matter, well, I guess I could help. This is not a good time. This is, we don't have the money, but I guess we could help. I hate not to help. But they come begging, we want to help. Why did they want to help? Verse 4 indicates. Well, the need was there, but there's something else. You're right. That's 100% right. I'm sorry? All right, help fellow Christians. There's a word here I'm looking for. Verse 4. They wanted to have... Absolutely. They wanted to have fellowship. By the way, make a marginal note here, at least in your mind. This is important. If I don't get to this, Michael will next time in chapter 9. Church contribution coming out of the church treasury, when a church helps someone in need out of the church treasury, it is having fellowship with them. So the question is, who can we have fellowship with? Can we have fellowship with the world? Can we have fellowship with non-Christians? Can we have fellowship with the unfaithful? Think about that for a moment. There's a lesson to be learned. But they wanted to have fellowship in the ministering of the saints. In other words, we want to have a part in that. We want, even though what we're giving may not equal what someone else gives, we want to have part in that. We want to have fellowship in that. They beg to be participants in that. Now, verses 5 and 6, here's why they did that. You tell me. Yeah. They went beyond what we'd even hoped because they first gave themselves and then to us by the will of God. And so we urge Titus that as he had begun, that he would also complete this grace with you as well. So Titus is one of the messengers, one of the three mentioned here, and we urged him to come by and get their contribution and get yours as well. And so they first gave their own selves. Now, that's his first example. He's going to give another one. But the first example is, look at the churches of Macedonia. So if you were a member, or let's just do it this way. Suppose you're one of the elders in the church at Corinth, and you got this letter and you've read thus far. What are you going to say to your fellow elder or elders? If they can do it, we can too. And besides that, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We've been planning on doing this. We just need to finish what we've been planning, right? Isn't that what he's saying? Search their hearts, absolutely. All right, let's go to the next section. The next section is the Corinthians here are urged to do the same thing now, just like we saw with the case of the Macedonians. Now, beginning at verse 8, let's get 7 and 8. Prove that you abound in love. I don't think Paul is questioning their love at all, but prove that. Verse 7, I think, begins a new thought, though some translation like the New King James thinks that finishes up the first thought, but that's all right. But as you abound in everything, in faith and in speech and in knowledge and in all diligence and in your love also, see that you also abound in this grace also. Now, let's come back to verse 8 in just a moment. There's some question, and I don't think that a lot of time spent is going to be real helpful, but there's some question. Were these matters that are mentioned here, did they include spiritual gifts? Some think so. For example, that you abound in knowledge, in light of 1 Corinthians 12, that might have been spiritual gift of knowledge, miraculous knowledge. Some think the matter of the utterance or speech may have reference to speaking in tongues. But you put whatever interpretation you want on that, we're going to come out at the same end in a moment. And that is, he commends the church now, though he had rebuked them earlier. There are some areas in which they abound and do well in their faith, in their speech, whether that's speaking the truth or is that speaking in tongues, or in their knowledge, in their dedication, their diligence, and their love for the Apostle Paul. And since you've abounded well in that, then add to that you need to abound well in this contribution. Does that make sense?
One of the things that you come for was their lack of love, that that's where they need to strengthen.
Yes.
This is actually a way for them to practice that.
Put it to the test and prove it. Yes, I think that's right.
It's not about the money. I think it's about what giving the money will do for this congregation that he loves is why he's urging them to participate in this. It's about what this will give to them, these people
Yeah.
that he loves, the growth that it will give them. It's not about gathering money.
That's a good point. Yeah, that they were lacking in love, and I take it from chapter 7 that there'd been a change in that to a degree that he thought, you're doing well from what I'm hearing from Titus in your love, that they had shown concerning this brother, and they need to reaffirm that love toward him and now give you proof of that. Now, verse 8 is I do not speak by commandment. And yet it was a command in 1 Corinthians 16, the contribution. And in chapter 9, we're going to see it's a command. So I don't think he's saying giving is not a command. But I think his point is, I'm not emphasizing the idea that it's commanded, because if you give merely because you're commanded, say again? Not doing it out of love? No good. Good point. It's not willing. So I think the point is, I do not speak by commandment. I'm not emphasizing this from the standpoint you're commanded, so get with it and do it, but I'm testing your love. I want you to be driven from love here in this matter and by the diligence of others. So I want you to be driven by two things, and you just mentioned the two things at the end of verse 8. Your love for the poor saints and the diligence of others, which would refer to Macedonians, yeah. So you abound in everything, now prove your love. That's the point. Now, another example that he gives is that of Christ. So let's get verse 9. It's kind of a standalone verse. What does he say about Christ? Yes. He was rich in glory. He was rich in heaven. And yet he became poor in the sense that he became man and lived as a man and took on flesh that you might become rich. And so look at the sacrifice that he made. And so that ought to be a motivating force. So we just mentioned three motivating forces. The example of the Macedonians, the love that you have for the poor saints, verse 8, and now verse 9, the example of Christ and his sacrifice. Make sense? Now then, this is where he gets to the heart of what he's trying to say here. Verses 10 through 12. Carry out the plans that you have made. So let's go back to our question. Question number 3. How long had it been since the Corinthians first said they would give? Yeah, at least a year. You were ready a year ago. All right, question number 4. What was the problem with the Corinthians' lack of giving? That they did not have the desire. Or I read that wrong, didn't I? These are Micah's questions. And so, his question makes sense. I know what mine are supposed to say. I don't always know what his are supposed to say. Let me read that again. Was the problem with the Corinthians' lack of giving that they did not have the desire? Now the question makes sense, if I read it right.
They had the means because they lived in a rich commerce city where they had the funds, so it must be all in their attitude, their state of mind, and their lack of love that they were poor this time. Now they've had a change of heart, maybe.
All right. Yeah, their problem, good point. Their problem isn't that they didn't desire to do it. In fact, they've been making plans to do that. They're just not acting upon the plans they make. Sound familiar? Sound familiar?
I read this as a different way. I read this as they were the first to begin gathering the money a year ago. But you're saying that usually interpreted that they haven't participated at all at this point.
I don't know if they haven't participated at all. I wouldn't word it that way. But that they had made their plans and they haven't completed their plans, according to verse 11. It is to your advantage. Let's start back at verse 10. That I give my advice. By the way, I want to comment on the word advice. I think that advice connects with the verse 8. I do not speak by commandment. I'm more urging and advising that you look at these examples and don't focus so much on the command as just being driven out of love. But nonetheless, it's your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago. The King James, I think, says you were ready a year ago. So had they put any contribution together? I assume they had. Had they completed their contribution and put all together that they needed to send? They had not, is what I'm taking that. That you began a year ago, and then verse 11, but now you also must complete the doing of it. The King James says, now therefore perform the doing of it. English Standard, Mark, read verse 11 for me. Verse 11, you have verse 11?
So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have.
All right, let's start over. I want y'all to listen to this. The English Standard helps us a little bit. I'm going to stop you. We'll start again. I'm going to stop you.
So now finish doing it as well,
Finish doing it as well. You're going to finish what you started. So I think they had started. Now go on.
so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have.
There we go. That's what I was looking for. That your readiness may be matched by what?
By your completing it.
By your completing. Does that make sense?
So they might have given, that there were some maybe given earlier.
Yeah.
But they've not finished what they had planned.
Their plans, I think the point is their plans didn't match, or their doing didn't match all of their plans. They were planning, they were doing in part, and yet they hadn't fulfilled that.
Or the plan was just to meet the need.
Yeah. And the need hadn't been met yet.
When they say readiness, that means now, right?
Yeah, they were ready to, let me go back and read. Therefore, there was a readiness to desire it, and there also must be the completion of what you have. In other words, I take it that they had made their plans, but they hadn't fulfilled all their plans, whether it's that we've sent some and there needs to be more because they plan to meet the need, or they had put their contribution together but hadn't sent it, or they hadn't gathered all the contribution together. I don't know. But their plans were one thing, and their fulfillment didn't match the plans. They were ready a year ago. Now, here's what I'm learning from this. I'm going to come back to this slide, so we're not leaving it. Verse 10 says we need to plan what we do. Would you agree with that? They had planned a year ahead. Maybe they should have done it a year ago. But they had planned. We need to plan what we're going to do. Verse 11 says you need to do what you plan. Why is that practical? Aside from contribution, just general church work. Good point. Good point. It's one thing to plan, but it's another thing to execute the plan. I have seen many times churches plan, we're going to do thus and so. It may be building a building. It may be we're going to start a new program to reach the lost, or we're going to do whatever, and then we drag our feet, and a year later we're still planning. I was once part of a church back, this sounds a little unreasonable, but if you got to put this back in the 80s, back when copiers were not a big thing and they were kind of new to churches buying them. We had in the budget to buy a copier so we could print the bulletin on that. A year later, it would be announced we have money in the budget for a copier. We just need to get around to buying a new copier. The next year, it'd be announced we've got money in the budget for a copier. We just ain't got around to buying it. There's 5 years we had it in the budget. And once in a while, somebody would quote this passage and say, now therefore perform the doing of it. You planned it, let's do it. Let's get on with it. All right, let's go back now to verse 12. We got verse 10 and 11. Verse 12, for if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what one does not have. The point here is the first requirement to carrying out your plan is to be like the Macedonians And what was it that was like the Macedonians, according to verse 12 and verse 5, the comparison? There must first be a willing mind to do that. All right, now let's get to the more difficult section, for me at least, and that is to have equality. What is this about? There's several questions. We don't have time to go into all of those. So let's talk about that a little bit. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. In other words, my instruction to you is not that others then don't have to give, and then you're going to bear a heavy burden so that you carry the load of that. That's not what I'm interested in. But I do mean that others, are verse 14, but by an equality that now at the time your abundance may supply their lack, and their abundance may supply your lack, that there may be equality. Now, we're going to decipher more of that in just a moment, but here's the bottom line, I think. That I think he's saying that by your giving and the Macedonians giving to those poor saints, there's equality in the sense that basic needs are supplied. Now, he quotes at verse 15, he that gathers much had nothing left over, and he that gathered little had no lack. Where's that found? Absolutely. Go ahead. Yes, 16th chapter. Very good. When they're gathering the manna. And the context we don't have time to go into, but the context deals with supplying basic needs. So that passage in its context best fits that interpretation, that he's basically talking about supplying basic needs. It's not saying that you are to have the same amount someone else has. And so there needs to be, this is not some kind of socialistic concept that let's take from the rich and give to the poor and let's equalize it so we all have the same in our bank accounts. And so if I have $100 and you have 10, then I need to make sure you've got 50 and I've got 50, now we're equal. That's not the point. But basic needs are met. Make sense? I think that's what he's talking about. Now here's the question at verse 14. That at the time of your abundance you may supply their lack, that their abundance may supply your lack. There's two interpretations of that, and I think the first is the one that makes more sense. I think he's saying you supply their need, and I'm paraphrasing here, and who knows but what in time you may be in need, and they may have to supply yours. Does that make sense? So when you're down on your luck, I may have to give you some money, and it may be next year I'm down on my luck and you may have to give me some. Make sense? Yes, ma'am.
I know you're using the term money here, but when you had what Melissa said earlier, by giving, they are getting their needs supplied because their need is that growth in love. And so, when we're doing something for someone else, we are supplying, it is a selfish thing, but we are supplying our own needs too.
And that's true. That's true. Another interpretation is that some of the commentators follow, and Curry doesn't take this with him, but he develops it and then says he doesn't think there's evidence of it. Nonetheless, that the gospel came out of Jerusalem and went to the Gentiles, and that they supplied, they took out of their liberality of the gospel and shared with you spiritually, and you can take materially and share with them. And that's a very common view that's taken, but I'm not sure that that's demanded by the context. Verse 15, I think, is going to be the key to helping us understand that. Does that make sense? That there is to be equality that needs, and we are supplying our own need when we do that. Now let's talk about the messengers here and finish this up in the last few minutes. What's the importance of the messengers being faithful? You tell me.
You're allowing them to have the message that's coming to you, but they're also sending you money back through these messengers. And they have to be honest and faithful to God and what they're doing. This is a God thing. It's not just what you're humanly doing for each other. God is showing through your actions.
All right. Very good. Titus is one of them that's mentioned. The next one that's mentioned is in verse 18. Well, verse 16 and 17 and verse 23 says concerning Titus that he is well accepted and that he's well trustworthy. I'm paraphrasing that. And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout the churches. Who is that? Well, this is Paul writing, and we have sent with him, so I don't think Paul sent himself. Point is, we don't know. Some think it was Barnabas. Some think it was Luke. That's guess. That's conjecture. We don't know who that was. It's just that there is some brother that was well known we sent with him. Apparently, when he got there, they would know and identify who he was and would know who he was. There's a third one, verse 22, and we have sent with them, that is, with this brother and Titus. Adding to those two is a third one, verse 22, whom we have often proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent because of the great confidence that we have in you. Who was he? We don't know. So there were three messengers that were sent carrying this contribution, and who were they? I don't know. Is it important we know? Must not be, because God didn't tell us. So I'm not too worried about who they were. Now, Acts 20 and verse 4 gives a list of companions of Paul, and it may have been some of that list, but again, that's conjecture if I pick out which one or which two of those. There's more than two mentioned. I pick out two, I think it is. That's conjecture, and your guess would be as good as mine with reference to that. Now, let's finish up by looking at verse 24. What does he tell them concerning the messengers? They're coming to get the contribution. Y'all need to get it together. Yes, absolutely. Prove that we're not wrong in the confidence that we have. I'm boasting and telling people of the confidence, and so prove me right, don't prove me wrong with reference to that. All right. We got time for one practical lesson. Who wants to go?
It's like God told us in Matthew 6 not to worry about your food or clothing. One of the ways.
That's one way our needs are taken care of. Good point. That we'll never starve as long as we're faithful because they're godly Christians helping take care of us. We'll end on that note, chapter 9. Next week, we will not have class. E.R. Hall will be preaching for us. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll go with chapter 9.